The sound of silence. Dr. Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she fought with the failing controls of her research vessel. The ship's warning systems blared through the cockpit, a cacophony of alarms that only heightened her sense of impending disaster. The uncharted planet's atmosphere tore at her ship's hull, turning her controlled descent into a spiraling plunge toward the surface. Mayday, mayday. This is Research Vessel Linguist 7. She broadcast, knowing the message would take years to reach Earth. Emergency landing on uncharted planet in the Kepler 247 system. Coordinates. The ship lurched violently, cutting off her transmission. The ground rushed up to meet her, a landscape of bioluminescent forests painting the night in ethereal blues and greens. Sarah braced for impact, her years of emergency training condensing into a single moment of clarity. The ship crashed through the canopy of glowing trees, each impact sending shudders through the reinforced hull, until finally, mercifully, it ground to a halt. Silence fell, broken only by the soft hiss of cooling metal and Sarah's ragged breathing. She performed a quick self-assessment. No major injuries, just bruises and minor cuts. The same couldn't be said for her ship. The hull had been breached in multiple places, and the quantum drive was beyond repair. As she gathered her emergency supplies, Sarah's linguistic training kicked in. She was uniquely qualified for first contact situations, fluent in 17 Earth languages and trained in xenolinguistics. Yet nothing in her preparation had covered a scenario quite like this. The planet's surface was a testament to evolutionary divergence. Bioluminescent flora dominated the landscape, creating a natural light show that made Earth's aurora borealis seem dim in comparison. Trees pulsed with internal light, their branches swaying in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sarah activated her suit's external sensors, analyzing the atmosphere. Breathable, if slightly higher in nitrogen than Earth standard. She removed her helmet, and that's when she noticed something peculiar. The absolute silence. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, nothing but the soft footfalls of her boots on the phosphorescent ground. She had taken perhaps 20 steps from her ship when she first saw them. The lumini emerged from behind a glowing vegetation like living constellations. Humanoid in basic shape, their translucent skin rippled with patterns of light that shifted and flowed like liquid starlight. Their large, multifaceted eyes reflected the bioluminescence around them, and they moved with a grace that suggested perfect adaptation to their environment. Sarah's scientific mind raced with observations. The patterns of light across their skin, they weren't random. They shifted in organized sequences, repeating with variations. A language. She reached for her portable recorder, wanting to document everything. "Hello," she said softly, raising her empty hands in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I come in peace." The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The lumini recoiled as if struck, their skin patterns erupting in harsh, jagged flashes of red and white. They retreated several steps, and Sarah noticed smaller figures, perhaps children, being pushed behind the adults. "Wait, please," she called out, taking a step forward. This only intensified their reaction. The entire group's bioluminescence synchronized into a pulsing pattern that made Sarah's head spin. She realized with growing horror that they were responding to her voice itself, to the very act of making sound. The lumini's retreat turned into a full flight, their light patterns leaving trailing afterimages in Sarah's vision as they disappeared into the forest. She stood alone in the alien night, the implications of what had just happened slowly sinking in. She had found intelligent life, yes, but her very method of communication was perceived as a weapon. Every word she spoke was an act of aggression in their eyes. Years of linguistic training, and she couldn't say a single word without causing panic. Sarah returned to her ship, mind racing. She needed to find a way to communicate, and fast. The crash had damaged most of her equipment, but her research tools might still be salvageable. As she dug through the wreckage, she found her tablet computer still functioning. It contained years of research on nonverbal communication methods. It would have to be enough. The next few hours were spent setting up a camp near her ship. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, aware that she was likely being watched. The forest around her continued its silent light show, but now she noticed subtle differences in the patterns. The trees themselves seemed to be responding to the presence of the lumini, their bioluminescence creating complex interference patterns that might carry meaning. As night deepened, new challenges emerged. Predators, attracted by the crash, began testing the perimeter of her camp. They were invisible save for faint bioluminescent markings. Their hunting patterns clearly evolved to take advantage of the planet's unique ecosystem. Sarah's first encounter with one nearly proved fatal. Only the emergency flare she carried saved her from being eviscerated by claws she never saw coming. The attack brought another revelation. The flash of the flare had sent the creature retreating in panic, much like the lumini's reaction to sound. Light, it seemed, was more than just communication here. It was a fundamental part of their sensory world, perhaps even a defense mechanism. Sarah spent that first night huddled in what remained of her ship's cockpit, her tablet's screen dimmed to its lowest setting as she worked. She began cataloging the patterns she'd observed, both from the lumini and the surrounding flora. There had to be a way to bridge this gap, to show them she wasn't a threat. As the planet's sun began to rise, a distant red dwarf that barely brightened the perpetual twilight, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't stay by her ship forever, and she needed to find a way to communicate with the lumini before her supplies ran out. More importantly, she needed to understand why sound was so foreign to their world. She gathered her essential supplies into a pack: water purifier, emergency rations, basic tools, and most importantly, her tablet and a small solar charger. The rest would have to stay behind. Before leaving, she rigged her ship's emergency beacon to be light-based rather than sonic, hoping it might serve as a first step toward peaceful contact. As Sarah set out into the alien forest, following the direction the lumini had fled, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. She had spent her career studying the power of words, only to find herself in a world where silence spoke volumes. Every step took her further from the familiar and deeper into a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about communication. What she didn't realize was that her every movement was being watched, not just by the lumini, but by something else, something that had evolved in this world of light and silence, something that saw her sound-making nature not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The forest around her continued its silent symphony, and somewhere in its depths, a young Lumini researcher named Elix was already breaking taboos by documenting the strange visitor's every move, fascinated by the impossibility of a being that wielded sound itself. Patterns in the dark. Elix moved through the bioluminescent undergrowth with practiced ease, their skin dimmed to match the ambient glow of the forest floor. 3 cycles had passed since the soundmaker's arrival, and against all cultural taboos and survival instincts, Elix couldn't stay away. Their research into nocturnal predator patterns had given them the perfect cover for observation, though the Council would hardly see it that way. Through their specialized optical membranes, Elix watched the human female set up another of her strange devices. Unlike the rest of their kind, who saw the soundmaker as a threat to be avoided, Elix noticed patterns in her behavior that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The human's movements were deliberate, careful, those of a researcher, not a predator. Sarah adjusted her makeshift light sensor array, frustrated by its limited functionality. She had spent days trying to decode the complex light patterns of the Lumini's communication, but without her ship's main computer, the task was proving nearly impossible. Her tablet recorded endless streams of data, but the patterns were too complex, too nuanced for its basic algorithms to process. A sudden movement caught her attention. One of the luminescent vines nearby was pulsing in an unusual sequence, not the normal rhythm she had documented. Sarah reached for her tablet, then froze. The pattern was repeating, too precise to be natural. Someone was trying to communicate. Elix's hearts raced as they manipulated the vine's bioluminescence. It was the simplest greeting pattern, one taught to younglings. the equivalent of a wave. They knew they were violating every safety protocol, but the humans' methodical study of their communication methods had convinced them that understanding was possible. Sarah held her breath, careful not to make a sound. Slowly, she reached into her pack and pulled out a small container of bioluminescent algae she had collected. She had been experimenting with it, learning to create crude patterns. With trembling hands, she released some of the algae onto a leaf, using her finger to trace a similar pulsing pattern. The response was immediate. A figure emerged from the underbrush. Tall, slender, with skin that rippled with complex patterns of blue and green. Unlike the others Sarah had seen, this one's movements showed curiosity rather than fear. Elix approached cautiously, their scientific interest warring with instinctual fear. The human remained still, which helped. It was the sounds they made that triggered the deepest terrors in Lumini psychology, not their physical presence. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached for her tablet, pulling up a simple animation she had created. It showed basic geometric shapes transforming in patterns she had observed in Lumini communication. She turned the screen toward the alien, its brightness dimmed to match the ambient light. Elix's skin flickered with excitement. The human was crude in her light shaping, yes, but the intent was clear. They responded with their own pattern, a simple sequence indicating understanding and greeting. Then, taking an enormous risk, they reached out and touched the tablet's screen. The moment was shattered by a violent tremor that shook the forest floor. Both Sarah and Elix stumbled, and in her surprise, Sarah let out a startled cry. Elix recoiled instinctively, their skin flaring with warning patterns, but they didn't flee. Instead, they gestured urgently at Sarah, their patterns shifting to what she interpreted as alarm. A massive shape moved through the forest, its bioluminescent markings forming hypnotic patterns designed to disorient prey. Sarah recognized it as the same species that had attacked her camp, but much larger. The predator's hunting lights pulsed in a way that made her dizzy, and she noticed Elix struggling to maintain their own light patterns. Without thinking, Sarah reached for her tablet and maximized its volume. She had noticed how the local wildlife reacted to sound, and she had a theory. The predator was almost upon them when she played her recording, a high-pitched frequency she had specifically isolated for defense. The effect was dramatic. The creature reared back, its hunting patterns disrupted by the unfamiliar sensation. Elix watched in amazement as the human wielded sound like a weapon, driving the predator away. But more importantly, they noticed that the sound was controlled, purposeful, not the chaotic noise they had been taught to fear. As the danger passed, Sarah quickly silenced her tablet and turned to Elix, worried she had frightened them away. Instead, she found them studying her with new intensity, their skin displaying patterns she hadn't seen before. Slowly, deliberately, Elix reached out and touched the tablet again, then pointed to their own chest. Sarah understood. She held up the tablet, then pointed to herself and mimed learning, teaching. Elix's patterns shifted to what she hoped was agreement. They had found common ground in their shared scientific curiosity and in the realization that their different abilities could complement each other. Over the next few hours, they developed a rudimentary system of communication. Elix taught Sarah more complex light patterns, correcting her clumsy attempts with surprising patience. In return, Sarah demonstrated how sound could be visualized on her tablet, showing Elix that it wasn't random noise but organized patterns, not unlike their own language of light. As the planet's weak sun began to set, Elix's patterns suddenly showed urgency. They pointed toward a distant glow on the horizon, then back at Sarah. The message was clear. They needed to go, but they wanted Sarah to follow. Sarah hesitated. Following a member of a species that feared her very nature seemed risky, but she had come here to make contact, to understand. And Elix had already shown more courage and curiosity than she had dared hope for. As they moved through the darkening forest, Sarah noticed something odd. The bioluminescent flora seemed to respond to Elix's presence, creating paths of light that guided their way. She realized that the Lumini's relationship with their environment went far deeper than she had imagined. Elix led her to a hidden structure that pulsed with subtle light, some kind of research station. Sarah guessed. Inside, walls of living tissue displayed complex light patterns that Sarah recognized as data, though she couldn't begin to decipher it. Elix's private research sanctuary, where they studied the planet's nocturnal ecosystem. As Elix began showing her their research, Sarah realized they had done more than just make first contact. They had found a kindred spirit, someone whose scientific curiosity outweighed their fears. Together, they might be able to bridge the gap between their species, but first, they needed to understand why the Lumini feared sound so deeply. The answer, Sarah would soon discover, lay in the planet's distant past, and in an approaching threat that would force both their species to overcome their limitations or face extinction. As the night deepened around them, neither Sarah nor Elix realized that their unlikely partnership would soon be tested in ways neither could imagine. The harmony of light. Inside Elix's research sanctuary, Sarah stared in wonder at the living data displays surrounding them. Each wall pulsed with information, charts and graphs rendered in shifting patterns of bioluminescence. But it was one particular display that held her attention, a historical record that finally explained the Lumini's fear of sound. Elix manipulated the light patterns, showing Sarah a devastating event from their planet's past. Thousands of cycles ago, their world had been struck by massive sonic storms, natural phenomena that shattered the crystalline structures that formed the basis of their civilization. The Lumini had evolved in a world where sound was associated only with destruction, while light became their means of life, communication, and culture. Sarah's tablet recorded everything as she and Elix worked to bridge their communication gap. They had developed a crude but effective system. Sarah would display sound waves on her tablet, while Elix would match them with corresponding light patterns. It was slow, painstaking work, but with each passing hour, their understanding grew. "Look at this," Sarah whispered to herself, forgetting momentarily as Elix flinched. She quickly apologized with a soothing light pattern she had learned. On her tablet, she had discovered something remarkable. Certain frequencies of sound matched perfectly with specific light patterns used in Lumini communication. It wasn't just coincidence. There was a mathematical relationship between their two languages. Elix's skin rippled with excitement as they grasped the implications. They moved to one of their specimens, a rare species of bioluminescent algae that responded to vibrations. Sarah watched in fascination as Elix demonstrated how the algae could translate sound waves into light patterns. Together, they began experimenting with this discovery. Sarah would generate careful, controlled sound frequencies on her tablet, while Elix used the algae to create corresponding light patterns. They were creating a new form of communication, a hybrid language that could bridge their two species. But their breakthrough was interrupted by an urgent message that flashed across the living walls. Other Lumini researchers had detected something approaching their world. A massive dust cloud, larger than any in their recorded history. Elix's patterns shifted to show deep concern as they explained the implications to Sarah. The dust cloud would block most of the light from their sun, already dim by Earth standards. For a species that rely on bioluminescence for everything from communication to navigation, this was potentially catastrophic. The Lumini's own light production required energy from their sun. In prolonged darkness, they would literally lose their voice. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She pulled up atmospheric data she had collected since her crash landing, correlating it with the Lumini's historical records. The patterns were clear. This wasn't a random event. The planet's orbit was carrying it through a dense debris field, and this was just the beginning. As if to confirm their fears, the first signs of the approaching cloud became visible in the sky. The already dim sunlight took on a reddish tinge, and the air felt heavier. The bioluminescent forest around them responded to the change, its patterns becoming more urgent, more chaotic. Elix's research sanctuary became a hub of activity as other Lumini scientists arrived, drawn by the crisis. Initially, They reacted with fear to Sarah's presence, but Elix's calm patterns and demonstrations of their joint research convinced them to stay. Soon, the room was alive with complex light patterns as the Lumini debated possible solutions. Sarah noticed something fascinating during these discussions. When the Lumini became agitated, their light patterns created interference waves that reminded her of sound harmonics. She began recording these patterns, comparing them to acoustic principles she had studied on Earth. An idea started to form. Crazy, perhaps, but backed by the science they had uncovered. She turned to Elix, using their newly developed hybrid communication to explain her theory. Sound waves and light waves weren't so different. Both were forms of energy that could be converted, manipulated, and amplified. If they could adapt her ship's damaged sonic equipment to work with the Lumini's bioluminescent technology, they might be able to create a new form of energy generation, one that could help the Lumini maintain their light even in darkness. But it would require the Lumini to overcome their deepest fears and embrace the very thing they had evolved to avoid. Elix understood the risk, but also the potential. Their own research had shown them that their ancestors' fear of sound, while once justified, had become a limitation. They began to explain Sarah's idea to the others, their patterns precise and persuasive. The debate that followed was intense, the sanctuary's walls flickering with competing arguments. Some Lumini supported the idea, seeing it as their only chance for survival. Others warned that working with sound technology could destroy what remained of their civilization. As the discussion continued, Sarah noticed something even more alarming. The dust cloud was affecting the local ecosystem faster than predicted. The bioluminescent flora was already dimming, struggling to maintain its light in the fading sun. Without these plants, the Lumini would lose not just their primary food source, but also their entire infrastructure, which was based on bioorganic light technology. The crisis forced a decision. The Lumini Council, after reviewing Elix and Sarah's research, gave them permission to attempt their radical solution. But they had to work fast. The dust cloud was approaching rapidly, and they would need to modify both Lumini technology and Sarah's damaged equipment to create their hybrid system. As they left the sanctuary to begin their work, Sarah and Elix paused to look at the darkening sky. They had achieved what seemed impossible, a true meeting of minds across the gulf of completely alien physiologies and cultures. But their greatest challenge still lay ahead. They would need to convince an entire civilization to trust in something they had feared for generations. And they would need to do it before the light faded completely, plunging their world into a darkness from which it might never emerge. The growing storm. The journey back to Sarah's crashed ship was a race against deepening twilight. The dust cloud now covered a quarter of the sky, its ominous red-brown mass visibly advancing with each passing hour. Around them, the bioluminescent forest was already showing signs of stress, its usual brilliant patterns becoming erratic and dim. Elix led a team of Lumini scientists, each chosen for their specialized knowledge of bioorganic technology. Their skin patterns flickered with a mix of determination and barely contained fear as they approached the crash site. Despite the Council's approval, being this close to a source of sound technology went against every instinct their species possessed. Sarah's ship lay partially embedded in the forest floor, its hull now integrated into the living ecosystem. Bioluminescent vines had grown through breaches in the metal, creating an otherworldly fusion of technology and biology. As they began salvaging the sonic equipment, Sarah noticed how the local flora had adapted to the ship's presence, using its metal structure as a conductor for their light patterns. "That's it," Sarah whispered to herself, careful to modulate her voice to the frequencies she and Elix had determined were least disturbing to the Lumini. The plants aren't just growing on the ship, they're using it to amplify their communications. Elix's patterns shifted to show understanding and excitement. They directed other Lumini to examine specific parts of the ship where the integration was most pronounced. Sarah's tablet recorded everything, correlating the data with their earlier discoveries about the relationship between sound and light waves. Their work was interrupted by a low rumble, not sound, but a vibration that shook the ground itself. The dust cloud was affecting the planet's atmospheric pressure, creating gravitational disturbances that threatened to tear apart the delicate ecosystem. The Lumini's patterns became chaotic with alarm as several massive trees crashed down nearby, their bioluminescent root systems exposed and failing. "We need to move faster," Sarah conveyed through their hybrid communication system. The equipment they needed was buried in the ship's stern, and excavating it without damaging the integrated biological systems would take precious time they didn't have. As they worked, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. The Lumini scientists, despite their initial fear, were beginning to coordinate their light patterns with the ship's residual energy signatures. They were unconsciously creating harmonic patterns that stabilized the surrounding vegetation, preventing further collapse. Helix documented this phenomenon, their scientists' curiosity overriding cultural taboos. They had discovered that their species' light-based communication could synchronize with human technology in ways they never imagined possible. But would this discovery come too late? The dust cloud now covered half the sky, and the effect on the Lumini was becoming apparent. Their light patterns were noticeably dimmer, requiring more energy to maintain. Some of the younger scientists had to rest frequently, their bodies struggling to produce enough bioluminescence in the fading light. Finally, they'd reached the ship's sonic array, the core technology Sarah believed could save them. But as they began to extract it, another gravitational wave hit, stronger than before. The ground buckled, opening fissures that glowed with the light of exposed underground fungal networks. Sarah found herself pulled to safety by Helix as a chasm opened where she had been standing. The Lumini scientists' normally careful light patterns were intense with fear and concern. In that moment of crisis, they had overcome their fear of physical contact with the soundmaker to save her life. The rescue sparked something in the other Lumini. Their patterns shifted from fear to determination as they worked together to stabilize the equipment. They began using their combined light patterns to create a protective field around the work area, demonstrating a level of cooperative bioluminescence Sarah hadn't thought possible. But their success came with a disturbing discovery. The sonic array was more damaged than Sarah had initially assessed. The primary amplification matrix, crucial to their plan, was cracked. Without it, they couldn't generate the frequencies needed to power their hybrid system. Helix studied the damaged component, their patterns showing deep concentration. Then, to Sarah's amazement, they began to manipulate the bioluminescent fungi that had grown through the ship. Under their guidance, the living light began to fill the cracks in the matrix, creating organic circuitry that merged perfectly with the human technology. It was a brilliant solution, but it came with a terrible risk. The Lumini scientists would need to maintain direct contact with the hybrid system, using their own bioluminescence to stabilize the organic components. They would be exposing themselves to concentrated sound waves, their civilization's greatest fear, for an extended period. The implications weren't lost on anyone. Sarah looked at each Lumini scientist, seeing their patterns shift with various emotions: fear, determination, hope. They all understood what was being asked of them. This wasn't just about saving their world anymore. It was about evolving beyond limitations that had defined their species for generations. As they prepared to transport the modified equipment back to the Lumini settlement, the dust cloud claimed another quarter of the sky. The forest around them was dying, its light fading like stars going out one by one. They had to move the hybrid system through a landscape that was literally going dark, guided only by their own fading bioluminescence. Sarah watched Helix organizing the others, their patterns now strong and clear despite their diminishing energy. They had all come so far from that first terrified encounter. But as they began their desperate journey through the dying forest, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, even if they succeeded in building their device, would it be enough to save a civilization of light from the coming darkness? The answer lay ahead of them, in a final test that would either bridge their worlds forever or confirm their ancestral fears about the destructive nature of sound. And time was running out. A new frequency, The Lumini settlement pulsed with a desperate light as they made their final preparations. The dust cloud now covered almost the entire sky, leaving only a small patch of dim starlight visible. The once vibrant bioluminescent structures were fading, their light patterns becoming whispers of their former brilliance. Sarah and Elix worked frantically to assemble their hybrid device in the settlement's central chamber. The salvaged sonic array, now integrated with living bioluminescent tissue, looked like something from both a dream and a nightmare. A fusion of angular human technology and organic Lumini architecture that pulsed with an uncertain rhythm. The resonance patterns aren't stabilizing. Sarah communicated to Elix through their light-based interface. The hybrid system was proving more complex than they had anticipated. Each time they thought they had achieved harmony between sound and light, the frequencies would drift apart, threatening to tear the delicate organic components apart. Elix's response patterns showed frustration tinged with determination. They had gathered the settlement's most skilled light shapers, Lumini who could manipulate bioluminescence with extraordinary precision. But even their combined efforts couldn't maintain the delicate balance needed to power the device. A deep tremor shook the settlement, stronger than any before. The remaining light from the sky vanished as the dust cloud completed its coverage. Around them, the great bioluminescent trees that had sustained the Lumini for countless generations began to dim, their light patterns becoming erratic and weak. Sarah watched in horror as the younger Lumini, including several children, started to flicker dangerously. Their bodies, evolved to depend on the sun's energy for bioluminescence, were failing faster than the adults. Without light, they couldn't communicate, couldn't express their fear, couldn't call for help. It was this sight that sparked something in Sarah's mind, a memory of her early linguistics training. "We're thinking about this wrong," she realized, her patterns urgent as she communicated with Elix. "We're trying to convert sound to light, but what if we're missing something more fundamental?" She pulled up her tablet's last remaining power to display a complex wave pattern. "Look at the harmonics. When your ancestors experienced those devastating sonic storms, they weren't just hearing sound. They were feeling vibration. And vibration." Elix's patterns flared with sudden understanding. Vibration was the common ground between their worlds, the foundation that connected sound and light at their most basic level. They weren't trying to replace one with the other. They needed to find the frequency where they became one. Working with renewed purpose, they modified the hybrid device. Instead of trying to generate light directly, they would create a resonance field, a harmony of vibration that would amplify the Lumini's natural bioluminescence. But to achieve the necessary power, they would need something unprecedented. The entire settlement would have to synchronize their light patterns while in direct contact with the sonic technology. The proposal was met with initial horror. What they were suggesting went against every cultural taboo, every instinct of self-preservation. But as the darkness deepened and more young ones began to fade, the choice became clear. The Lumini Council made their decision. In the central chamber, hundreds of Lumini gathered, their dimming bodies forming concentric circles around the hybrid device. Sarah stood at the control interface, while Elix prepared to lead their people in the synchronized light pattern. "Ready?" Sarah asked through their silent language. Elix's response was a pattern of pure trust and determination. Sarah activated the sonic array. The chamber filled with a deep, rhythmic vibration, carefully calibrated to match the frequency of Lumini bioluminescence. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, slowly, the Lumini closest to the device began to pulse in sync with the vibration. The effect spread outward like ripples in a pond. Each circle of Lumini joined the harmony, their light patterns growing stronger as they synchronized with the device's resonance. The chamber began to glow with an intensity Sarah had never seen before. But it wasn't enough. The power drain was enormous, and the organic components of their hybrid system were beginning to break down. They needed something more, something to amplify the effect beyond the settlement's walls. That's when the children, the same ones who had been fading moments before, broke from their parents and moved toward the device. Led by instinct unencumbered by generations of fear, they placed their hands directly on the sonic array. Their small bodies began to pulse with brilliant light, perfectly in tune with the vibrations. The adult Lumini watched in awe as their children demonstrated what they had been too afraid to discover, that sound and light could do more than coexist. They could strengthen each other. Following the children's lead, the entire settlement surged forward. Hundreds of hands touched the device. Hundreds of bodies synchronized their light with its pulse. The chamber erupted in a spectacular display of harmonized energy that shot upward through the settlement's bioorganic architecture. The effect was exponential. The energy field expanded outward, rejuvenating the dying forest. The bioluminescent trees responded to the harmonic frequency, their light returning stronger than before. A new network of communication was forming, one that used both sound and light to carry energy and information. Sarah and Elix watched in amazement as their world was transformed. The Lumini were not just surviving the darkness. They were transcending it. Their fear of sound had been replaced by understanding of its power to amplify and enhance their natural abilities. A new frequency. The Lumini settlement pulsed with a desperate light as they made their final preparations. The dust cloud now covered almost the entire sky, leaving only a small patch of dim starlight visible. The once vibrant bioluminescent structures were fading, their light patterns becoming whispers of their former brilliance. Sarah and Elix worked frantically to assemble their hybrid device in the settlement's central chamber. The salvaged sonic array, now integrated with living bioluminescent tissue, looked like something from both a dream and a nightmare, a fusion of angular human technology and organic Lumini architecture that pulsed with an uncertain rhythm. The resonance patterns aren't stabilizing. Sarah communicated to Elix through their light-based interface. The hybrid system was proving more complex than they had anticipated. Each time they thought they had achieved harmony between sound and light, the frequencies would drift apart, threatening to tear the delicate organic components apart. Elix's response patterns showed frustration tinged with determination. They had gathered the settlement's most skilled light shapers, Lumini who could manipulate bioluminescence with extraordinary precision. But even their combined efforts couldn't maintain the delicate balance needed to power the device. A deep tremor shook the settlement, stronger than any before. The remaining light from the sky vanished as the dust cloud completed its coverage. Around them, the great bioluminescent trees that had sustained the Lumini for countless generations began to dim, their light patterns becoming erratic and weak. Sarah watched in horror as the younger Lumini, including several children, started to flicker dangerously. Their bodies, evolved to depend on the sun's energy for bioluminescence, were failing faster than the adults. Without light, they couldn't communicate, couldn't express their fear, couldn't call for help. It was this sight that sparked something in Sarah's mind, a memory of her early linguistics training. "We're thinking about this wrong," she realized, her patterns urgent as she communicated with Elix. "We're trying to convert sound to light, but what if we're missing something more fundamental?" She pulled up her tablet's last remaining power to display a complex wave pattern. "Look at the harmonics. When your ancestors experienced those devastating sonic storms, they weren't just hearing sound, they were feeling vibration. And vibration." Elix's patterns flared with sudden understanding. Vibration was the common ground between their worlds, the foundation that connected sound and light at their most basic level. They weren't trying to replace one with the other. They needed to find the frequency where they became one. Working with renewed purpose, they modified the hybrid device. Instead of trying to generate light directly, they would create a resonance field, a harmony of vibration that would amplify the Lumini's natural bioluminescence. But to achieve the necessary power, they would need something unprecedented. The entire settlement would have to synchronize their light patterns while in direct contact with the sonic technology. The proposal was met with initial horror. What they were suggesting went against every cultural taboo, every instinct of self-preservation. But as the darkness deepened and more young ones began to fade, the choice became clear. The Lumini Council made their decision. In the central chamber, hundreds of lumini gathered, their dimming bodies forming concentric circles around the hybrid device. Sarah stood at the control interface, while Elix prepared to lead their people in the synchronized light pattern. "Ready?" Sarah asked through their silent language. Elix's response was a pattern of pure trust and determination. Sarah activated the sonic array. The chamber filled with a deep, rhythmic vibration, carefully calibrated to match the frequency of lumini bioluminescence. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, slowly, the lumini closest to the device began to pulse in sync with the vibration. The effect spread outward like ripples in a pond. Each circle of lumini joined the harmony, their light patterns growing stronger as they synchronized with the device's resonance. The chamber began to glow with an intensity Sarah had never seen before. But it wasn't enough. The power drain was enormous, and the organic components of their hybrid system were beginning to break down. They needed something more, something to amplify the effect beyond the settlement's walls. That's when the children, the same ones who had been fading moments before, broke from their parents and moved toward the device. Led by instinct unencumbered by generations of fear, they placed their hands directly on the sonic array. Their small bodies began to pulse with brilliant light, perfectly in tune with the vibrations. The adult lumini watched in awe as their children demonstrated what they had been too afraid to discover, that sound and light could do more than coexist. They could strengthen each other. Following the children's lead, the entire settlement surged forward. Hundreds of hands touched the device. Hundreds of bodies synchronized their light with its pulse. The chamber erupted in a spectacular display of harmonized energy that shot upward through the settlement's bioorganic architecture. The effect was exponential. The energy field expanded outward, rejuvenating the dying forest. The bioluminescent trees responded to the harmonic frequency, their light returning stronger than before. A new network of communication was forming, one that used both sound and light to carry energy and information. Sarah and Elix watched in amazement as their world was transformed. The lumini were not just surviving the darkness, they were transcending it. Their fear of sound had been replaced by understanding of its power to amplify and enhance their natural abilities. As the dust cloud continued its passage over their world, the lumini discovered they no longer needed direct sunlight to maintain their bioluminescence. The harmonic network they had created provided